Maybe just beginning by inviting everyone on the call to take a very deep breath. Just using that breath to notice what might be happening in your body right now. Because I noticed that for myself, with the reminder and the acknowledgement of some of what's going on in the world that Julio shared with us in the very beginning, even just that awareness, bringing us back to that awareness, made my heart flutter. And I can feel my heart beating a little faster than before. And of course, for some of us in this community on this call, those reminders of the harm that our Black family members have to go through on this land lands differently. And so I just want to bring into this space the names of Ahmaud Arbery and also Christian Cooper, who, he's still with us. But we know how quickly that can change. One of my most important teachers, someone who's very important to this entire community, Musham, once told me that oftentimes in healing spaces, we have a tendency sometimes to get, she said it as indulgent in our pain. That it actually feels good to use healing spaces to actually allow ourselves to sit with whatever's coming up, but that sometimes that we can get stuck there. And the intention of spiritual practice is not to get stuck in these feelings and in these emotions, but to be able to use these practices to move through them. And so I hope that we can use this time tonight to really honor and welcome whatever is coming up for all of us, and know that if it's rage, that is welcome here. That if it's grief, that's welcome here. That if it's loss and confusion, that all of that is welcome here. I've mostly been offline for the last little while, so I'm actually finding out about a lot of this just in the last hour. So I'm moving through it myself. So just want to invite all of us to just be with wherever we're at with all of that. And so with that, we'll enter into a brief period of practice, and I want to invite people into a comfortable and stable seated position, or if you'd like, you can lay down. Or as you bring awareness to your body, if you feel like you need to move, also want to invite that, whatever your body feels like it needs in this moment. And if you feel comfortable, you can also shut off your video during this period. I know some people feel a little better with that. And if you'd like, you can gently close your eyes. Otherwise, perhaps leaving a soft gaze in front of you. And one more time, just taking a deep breath. Feeling your chest rise. And exhaling with a sound if that feels supportive. One more time, breathing in. Deep breath out. And just gently falling into a natural breathing cycle. Just noticing how your body is breathing naturally right now. You don't have to change it. You don't have to think about why. Just noticing how you're breathing. Just trying to be aware in each moment exactly where in the cycle of your breath you're in, and how you know that you're breathing in this exact moment. We'll just spend a few moments in silence, tracking our breaths. using that to quiet our mind and to begin to bring concentration. Noticing in each moment that even without us bringing awareness to our breath, that breath is always there, always supporting us. As often as we need to, every time that we notice our mind has wandered, just gently nudging the focus of your attention back to your breath, offering gratitude to your breath for always being there. as our mind slowly starts to calm, expanding the focus of your attention to your entire body and creating some space for any struggles, for any difficult emotions, for any physical pain, for all of that to be held, to be seen, to be welcome. Knowing that in our society, we sometimes have a tendency to try to push these things away, to try to ignore them, to try to distract ourselves from feeling them. Reminding ourselves that the intention of spiritual practice is for us to have the courage to look directly with these emotions, to have a relationship with these emotions and with this pain, and to know that each of us is strong enough to be with it. We also often have a tendency to notice these emotions and to try to explain it, to try to fix it. We ask ourselves where this is coming from, why this is happening, what we should do about it. I want to honor all of those questions, but also to try to let go of all of that in this moment and just simply be with whatever you may be holding. Just noticing where in your body you're holding these feelings. If it's rage that you're feeling, to welcome rage, to be grateful for rage, knowing that sometimes that earth lights a fire to burn down a forest so that new beauty and new life can emerge on the other side of that. That rage is a gift. It points us in the direction of skillful action. So if it's rage that you're holding, what does it feel like to be grateful for it, to welcome it? If it's grief that you're holding, creating space for grief, offering thanks for grief. Knowing that the laughter that follows a good cry, some of the purest laughter, the purest joy. Allowing ourselves to feel deeply, to grieve deeply. It's a path towards clean, pure joy. So what does it feel like to give gratitude for grief, the space for grief? Noticing that even as you sit with what might feel like difficult emotions, that your breath is still there to support you. Knowing that as you sit with the pain and the struggles and the trauma suffered not only by you, but your ancestors, that you also hold the intergenerational wisdom, the healing that has been passed down from generation to generation. Knowing that we have all of that support, knowing we have everything that we need to heal through our trauma. What does it feel like to welcome everything that might be present for you? so often tell ourselves that there are pieces of us that aren't welcome, whether that's rage or grief, pain, loneliness, shame. What would it feel like to know that all of that is a gift? That all of who you are is welcome in this moment, in however way it's showing up. There's nothing to fight, nothing to fix, nothing to solve. Just for this moment, every part of you is welcome. Perhaps using your breath, create a sense of expansiveness inside of yourself. Space that's big enough to hold all of what you may be holding. With each in-breath, feeling that expansiveness get bigger and bigger. And with each out-breath, feeling the strength of your container. In these last few minutes of our practice, continuing to offer gratitude, to offer metta for all of what you're holding. Thank you, rage, for guiding me into action. Thank you, loneliness, for reminding me the importance of relationship. Thank you, pain, pointing me in the direction of healing. Thank you, grief, for allowing me to feel joy. Just continuing to breathe into all of that. Thank you all for coming back. I know that was a very short break. Some people may still be making their way back, but I just want to share my screen for some thoughts that I wanted to share for the evening. So, Julio, I can still see you. Can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see this? Great, thank you. So I wanted to talk tonight about this idea of the fractal nature of change. I think it's a very timely time to be exploring what it looks like, what it feels like to engage in the act of healing collective trauma. The word Dharma, as many of you know, the word is oftentimes used to refer to the teachings of the historical Buddha. But before that, the word Dharma simply meant the universal laws of the universe. And I oftentimes think about things like gravity, right? That gravity is a universal law of nature. So it doesn't matter if you don't believe in gravity, you're still governed by its laws because that's just how the universe works. And I believe that there are similar universal laws of nature, similar dharma, around our relationship with things like trauma and healing and change. And this idea of change being fractal, I think many of us are familiar with what a fractal is. One dictionary definition talks about it as a curve or geometric figure, each part of which has the same statistical characteristic as the whole. So no matter how closely you zoom into something or how far out you zoom out, the patterns repeat themselves and it looks the same. And we see a lot of examples of fractals in nature. Some of the more famous ones are things like the nautilus seashell, Romanesco broccoli, a lot of succulent plants. And the way I think about it's on a kind of on a different level is when I think about how electrons circle the nucleus of its cell. And then when we extrapolate that out one level and we look at how a hurricane circles the eye of the hurricane, and we extrapolate that out one more level and you look at how planets rotate around its sun, and then you continue to extrapolate that out and you look at how a universe circles around the center of its galaxy. That no matter what scale you're looking at things, the laws of physics govern that these patterns continue to repeat themselves. And the way I think about that in relation to trauma is that there's a family member that obviously I love dearly who has a lot of unhealed trauma from childhood. And over many, many years, particularly the last 5 or 6 years, we've spent so much time trying to support her. And like every time, it feels like it's like whack-a-mole. Like every time we support her around one thing and that gets better, another issue comes out. And so we've talked to her and supported her around challenges with money, relationships with her daughter, her personal relationships, her work. And it just feels like this never-ending cycle. And at some point, I realized that with this person, she has some core central traumas that started in childhood. And that until we're able to work to support her in healing that core trauma, there's always going to be manifestations of trauma, right? And it's like going to be this never-ending game of whack-a-mole. And so when I had that insight and I tried to extrapolate that out one more level, I think about a nonprofit organization that I used to volunteer with. And they do amazing work. Like their external work is really doing an incredible job helping to heal and transform communities. And yet, at the very beginning, at the very foundation of this organization, some of the leadership had some really unhealthy patterns that kind of sank into the organizational culture. Some of those things are really toxic top-down ways of making decisions. Some of them are also an unwillingness to look at issues of race and power and privilege within their organization. And those things kind of sank into the culture of that organization that 20, 30 years later, even though the individual people in the organization are completely different, that is manifesting in so many, like this is an organization that year after year after year, there's some scandal, some conflict, volunteers leaving, staff leaving on really unhealthy terms. And of course, with this organization, it's because the organization collectively has trauma that it never dealt with. And so until that organization is able to go back into its history and work on healing some of its trauma, there's always going to be manifestations. It's that never-ending game of whack-a-mole. And so we take that concept and extrapolate that out one more level. And I look at this nation, the so-called United States of America that most of us live in. And there are a never-ending amount of issues to work on. There are constantly new issues popping up, old issues that haven't been dealt with. And in all of these issues, there are amazing communities doing work to pass pieces of legislation, to pass new policy. There's always victories. But it also feels like this never-ending game of whack-a-mole where we win one major victory, but then we take a step back and look out at the larger world, and it feels like nothing has changed. And from my perspective, a lot of that has to do with the fact that this country, this nation that we now know as the United States of America, has some significant core trauma that we have adopted collectively that we have never healed, right? We live on a land whose wealth is built on stolen land and the genocide of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of African peoples. And you cannot go through an experience that severe and have it not traumatize you, regardless of the positionality and the role you were playing. That is a traumatizing experience. And so collectively, as people who live on these lands, we have adopted that trauma, and collectively we hold that trauma. My introduction to social change work as well as Buddhist practice came at the age of 17 when I participated in this thing called the Interfaith Pilgrimage of the Middle Passage, where a Japanese Buddhist organization initiated a walking pilgrimage, walking from Massachusetts down the coast of New Orleans, and then eventually down the coast of Africa to retrace the slave route. Because they understood that the incidence of racism that we deal with in our country today is the direct manifestation of that core trauma, right? And that is something that we as a nation collectively have never even attempted at healing. And so if we want to really give justice to Ahmaud Arbery, it's not just about locking up the two men responsible for taking his life, but we actually have to go back to the beginning of the history of that conflict and heal this open wound that is the direct impact of the enslavement of African peoples on this land, right? And that until we deal with that core trauma, we're going to be playing whack-a-mole with racist incident after racist incident after racist incident. Many of you know, I think that my core kind of practice and being in the world is that of a nonviolence trainer. And in my work in nonviolence, we oftentimes teach that the more escalated a conflict is, the more escalated our nonviolent response to that conflict has to be. Right. So if somebody is going through a relatively normal or like not as escalated level of a conflict, you might be able to go up to that person and say, everything's going to be fine. Just take a deep breath. And that might prevent them from escalating even further. Right. And on a social scale, that might look like a petition. Like if you live in right outside of my house, there's an intersection that looks like it's a four-way stop sign, but it's not. So there's a lot of accidents. And luckily, it's not a street that people travel too fast on. So no one's ever been like that significantly hurt that I know of, but there's a lot of car accidents. And so like filling out a petition and bringing that petition to city council might be the appropriate response for a relatively low intensity level of conflict. Whereas the higher the intensity level rises, like if two people are fighting, you may actually have to get in between the two people and separate the two parties. If a building is burning down, you may actually need to to rip open a door to get in to try to save someone. That's a very escalated response, like tearing down a door, but it's because it's in response to a very escalated situation. I know I definitely have lots of feelings about the UN and the idea of quote unquote peacekeeping, but just to try to kind of continue to make the point that the peacekeeping forces are like, we send in armed military personnel to try to keep two communities from killing each other because that conflict is so escalated. And again, in a kind of social movement context, some of you may have been there several years ago as part of an action where we shut down the San Francisco Bay Bridge for Black Lives Matter. That's a very escalated response, but it's because we're responding to an incredibly escalated form of violence, right? Filling out a petition to protest the killing of Ahmaud Arbery is not the appropriate response because we are responding to not just the killing of one person, but 500 years of this kind of violence. So it's appropriate, it's more appropriate perhaps to shut down a highway. And I believe that with the level of violence and the destruction that we're seeing on our planet today, that we need heightened levels of response. But one of the things that I've noticed in my time is that the more we escalate our nonviolent responses to conflict, the more we also tend to escalate things like polarization and division and separation. That the more escalated our tactics become, the more we tend to fall into this binary right versus wrong, us versus them worldview. And I'm convinced that it's that worldview that is actually at the core of so much of the destruction on this planet. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing with this training modality called fierce vulnerability that we've been exploring is around how we raise and escalate our nonviolent tactics to injustice while doubling down on healing, because we understand that the intention of nonviolent direct action for us is healing the collective trauma of our country, of this land. This is an escalated response to an escalated harm. And I want to invite all of us just to look at this image and maybe take a deep breath and just feel what might be happening in your body when you see this image. When we extrapolate this down, I don't know if you can extrapolate down if extrapolating is something that only happens going up, but when we bring this down a scale to an interpersonal level, an analogy for this image might look like this. Right? There's clear division. There's clear polarization. And it is not something that looks like it might be the most conducive to healing. At the same time, I want us to look at this image, very famous image. I'm sure most of us have seen it. And now take a look at this image and take a deep breath. And just feel what this feels like. Because to me, the tactics, the practical elements between the two images are pretty similar. This woman was also on the streets protesting for Black Lives Matter. This woman is also risking arrest, but it just feels like it's done with a different spirit. And the analogy in an interpersonal conflict might look like this. One of the pieces of work that I do is facilitate what are called quote unquote victim offender dialogues. They're dialogues between incarcerated people and the people that they harm. And this is an image from a dialogue that took place that was covered on CNN. The man on the left lost his daughter to violence, and the man on the right is the person that took his daughter's life away. And they're coming together as a way to open up the possibility of healing between them. And that is an incredibly powerful thing. And so a lot of what I've been exploring in my work, and a lot of what I think we need to be exploring as a community and as a society, is how we escalate our tactics. And, you know, like in a lot of nonviolent direct action movements, there's a thing about like, we're here to shut things down. And tactically, we may need to shut things down, like shutting down the San Francisco Bay Bridge. But how do we do it while actually showing up with a spirit of opening up opportunities for connection and healing and relationships? Like, how do we hold the dignity of all people, metta, for all people, because we believe in interdependence? I oftentimes say in my work that, you know, interdependence isn't something that we do just for the people that we love, right? The universe doesn't weave separate webs of interdependence based on our political affiliation. That's not how this stuff works. Dharma, the universal laws of nature, not the laws of nature for people on the left, not the laws of nature for people that we're already in loving relationships and community with, but the universal laws for all people. So if we are all interdependent, if my liberation is bound with the liberation of all people, then how do we acknowledge that the level of violence requires an extremely escalated response where we're actually saying no more, that this will not continue, while maintaining the dignity of all people, even in the situations of the most extreme, like that woman with two men dressed in riot gear running towards her, and yet able to stay grounded and assertive and calm and open. And so I want to talk a little bit about the kind of fractal nature of healing and integration. I shared a few thoughts about the fractal nature of trauma and how trauma manifests in fractal ways, and the impact of trauma manifests in fractal ways. And so I want to share a little bit about the fractal nature of healing, and then I'd love to open it up a little bit as well. I'm going to share a tool that many of us may be familiar with, and I find it to be a very simple way to understand how trauma works. There's what we call the comfort zone. Most of us, most of the time, exist in our comfort zone. And the comfort zone is where we're deeply grounded and connected with where we are in each moment, where we're not being pushed and challenged in any way, where we have full connection to our love and our metta and understanding and all of these things. And outside of the comfort zone, there's what we call the stretch zone. And the stretch zone is not always a comfortable place to be in, but it's where growth happens, right? Like, you don't grow in the comfort zone. If you go to the gym and you work out and you're not feeling a little bit of pain, a little bit of tension, a little bit of stretch, then you're doing something wrong, right? You're not actually getting stronger. The stretch zone is where we're being challenged a little bit and where things aren't always comfortable, but it's where growth happens. But it's where we're being challenged, where we're still connected enough that we're able to take in information. But, you can go to the gym and work out and get a great workout and sweat and feel a little bit of tension and feel great. But if we work out too hard, then we might pull a muscle. And that's when we enter our panic zone. The panic zone is, unlike the stretch zone, is not a productive place to be, right? It's when our trauma is being fully triggered and our amygdala takes over our brain and we go into fight, flight, or freeze, and we're unable to take in new information. Oftentimes what happens is trauma that happened to you 20 years ago is re-triggered, and your brain can't actually tell the difference of whether that fear, that danger, that trauma is something that is happening now in this moment, or it's something that happened to you 20 years ago. I've been working a lot with my own therapist around like generational trauma, right? That sometimes we enter into this panic zone and we don't even quite understand why, because it's not our experience that we're feeling, but it's our ancestral experiences that we're feeling. So logically, we don't even know why we're in this space, but yet that's where we find ourselves. And the stretch zone is like, it's a muscle like any other, right? That the more we work out our stretch zone, the bigger it gets. And I found that people with a lot of unhealed trauma have very little capacity to be in the stretch zone. They go from the comfort zone straight into panic. Also, for myself, I found that like even at times in my life where I was a pretty emotionally regulated person, there were certain things, like certain topics of conversation, certain childhood traumas, that if the conversation went in that direction, even though in other spaces I have a pretty healthy capacity to be in the stretch zone, like if we started talking about this one particular thing, I would go straight into panic. I used to be this way around some childhood trauma that I experienced, and I held on to it for 20 years, not realizing that I was holding on to it. And the first time that I ever talked about this experience, leading into it, I told myself that this is something that happened 20 years ago. and that I'm over it, that I healed through it, that it's not that serious. And then when I first started talking about it, I completely broke down and went straight into panic. Like I had no ability to be in the stretch zone around this one particular thing. So I couldn't take in information that people were telling me. I couldn't process the information for myself. I couldn't process the experience. I couldn't like slow down enough to really understand what was happening in my body. But over the last 10 years, I've done a lot of work around this particular thing. So my capacity to be in the stretch zone around that particular thing has really grown. And I think it's important for us to notice this comfort, stretch, panic zone and how it plays out on a macro level, on a social level today. Because, you know, we read some of these stories of some of what's happened in the past couple of weeks in this country. And for me, I read about those stories and it puts me in the stretch zone, right? I get upset. There's grief that comes up. I get confused about how to move forward. But for many members of our community, particularly those that identify as Black, it might be a lot harder for them to stay in the stretch zone, not because of any lack of capacity on their part. I want to be very clear about that. But it's because for Black and Indigenous communities, it's just been nonstop for 500 years. Like certain communities have not been given a single day to breathe enough to try to work out their stretch zone so that they can look at an image like what happened to Ahmaud Arbery and not go into panic. And so I think a lot of what we need to be asking ourselves today is how do we support the growth of our stretch zone individually and collectively? And within that, how do we specifically support communities who are more directly impacted by these incidents? And so I just want to share a few thoughts on that. You know, during the practice period, I talked about kind of the importance of rage work and grief work. Like that oftentimes like emotions like rage and grief are seen as like shadows, and when we feel them, we want to like tuck them away. And the problem with that, of course, as everyone here probably knows, is that like shadows grow in the darkness. And so when we don't have a relationship with that shadow, then it continues to grow, and then it kind of like leaks out in ways that we don't have control over. And so I think it's really important for us, and even in like, you know, in communities of nonviolent resistance, because that's where I find myself in a lot, there's oftentimes judgment around rage. Right? We tell people that rage is bad, that if you're angry, then you're doing it wrong, that you're practicing nonviolence wrong, and you need to go meditate more. And I think rage can be an incredible gift, and there's incredible power in that. But the East Bay Transformative Justice Collective has this great group agreement that they use when they do like more business meetings, where they say, this is not a place for healing, though healing may happen here. Like it's an acknowledgement that healing can happen in any moment, but this space that you're in is a business meeting, so don't bring the intention of opening up your trauma because it's actually not a safe place for you. And so for me, how I translate that to things like rage is that we need to create explicit spaces where people can release their rage. And in particular, I think we need to be really intentional about creating specific spaces for specific communities of people where they can feel safe enough to just like really sink into their rage. Because on the other side of that rage can be an incredibly skillful action that is guided by that rage. But it needs to be felt into, it needs to be released first. And that kind of rage work, that kind of grief work takes so much care and skill. Like this is one of the other challenges that I've seen a lot in a place like the Bay Area where there's a lot of honoring, at least on a surface level, to healing spaces, that people just like go and open up traumatic conversations everywhere they go. and everyone is all of a sudden a restorative justice facilitator and can think that they can open up conversations about trauma. And like rage work, healing work, we're performing surgery on people, spiritual and emotional surgery on people. And you don't go to some person who's never gone to medical school to perform an operation, right? These things take skill. And so I think one of the things that we as a community need to do is to create, like one of the things that, one of the networks where we're engaged in a lot of this practice and really trying to figure out how to put all of this from theory into practice is this network called the Yet to Be Named Network. That's a decentralized network of direct action teams working at the intersection of climate change and racial healing, with a lot of mindfulness and trauma healing incorporated into that. And one of the things that we're trying to build is a network of therapists and healers who are committed to working explicitly with marginalized communities. Because we understand that oftentimes in order to go to a direct action space, while being grounded in interdependence and love for all people, marginalized communities oftentimes have more hurdles that they need to get to that place, right? Communities who have not been as harmed by the police may find it easier to hold the dignity of those police officers. And so as a community, how do we be explicit about offering spaces more explicitly for the communities who have been most directly impacted by these issues, for them to be able to heal, for them to be able to grow their stretch zones? We're also very explicit about building an internal reparations fund, because if we wait for the state to do reparations, we will be waiting forever, right? We know this. And so we have an internal reparations fund where, like the last time we did a fierce vulnerability workshop, there was a trans Black man who came as a participant, and we actually gave this person $300 because he needed his car fixed to attend the workshop, right? And that's part of our commitment to the gift economy, is that equitable distribution. And so a lot of the reparations fund for us isn't just like, how do we give a part of our proceeds to the Segorote Land Trust and all of these things, but it's also like, if a person of a marginalized identity in our community needs to go get a massage, then our reparations fund welcomes that, right? If they need to go see their therapist for an extra session, or if they need to like go out for a fancy dinner or get a day off of work, like that's part of their healing and therefore part of our collective healing. And so we're investing in those kinds of systems. And we're also working, I'm a core member of an organization called the Ahimsa Collective, which does a lot of trauma healing work in prison. And a lot of the members of the Ahimsa Collective are formerly incarcerated people of color, and they're people who are incredibly talented at holding collective space for healing and for grief. And I'm trying to get more and more people, particularly people of color, particularly queer and trans folks that have those skills, to commit themselves not only to holding these kind of healing spaces in circles in prison, but doing it explicitly for marginalized communities who are on the front lines. Because we need those skills on the front lines supporting the communities that are most directly impacted. And the last piece that I want to share before I open it up is, this isn't just a workshop. We're here in Sangha, here at the East Bay Meditation Center. And so just asking ourselves, what is the intention of our spiritual practice? Because I found that there are plenty of meditation spaces where there's a lot of incredible guidance and instruction given on how to sit with our grief and how to sit with our rage, but oftentimes as a way to just learn to be okay with our rage so that we can keep moving throughout our day, right? Like Google brings in mindfulness practices so that their employees can be better capitalists. The military and police departments bring in meditation practices so they can create more efficient killers, so that someone whose job it is to harm life and to harm communities can be okay with that. And that, I don't think that's what the historical Buddha meant, right? I believe that real spiritual practice is to give us the courage to sit with these difficult emotions so that it can spring us into action. Because we know that because change is fractal, because we are interdependent, because we are interbeing with each other, that it doesn't matter how much healing I do, that if we're not working on the liberation of the collective, then I will always be broken. And same for activist communities who are only working on systemic change, that if all you're working on is to change policies and not doing the internal spiritual work of purifying our own hearts of resentment and pain and isolation and shame and all these things, then society is always going to be broken. One of our incarcerated trainers in Soledad prison, he talks about how, he says, resolving a conflict is about fixing issues and reconciling a conflict is about repairing relationships. And that in a lot of activist communities, we only go so far as to figure out how to fix an issue. Like if we protest this organization, then we can gain enough power to pass this piece of legislation. But we're not actually healing the relationship between those two sides. And harm and trauma happens in relationship. And so healing also needs to happen in relationship. And so for those of us who are engaged in this kind of spiritual practice, where we're sitting every single day, to be really clear and explicit about what is the intention of our spiritual practice and the intention of our spiritual growth. That once we incorporate Shila, the ethics of the practice of samadhi, the practice of concentration, then it's not enough just for us to be learning to breathe through the tension and to breathe through the anger and to breathe through the stress so that we can keep going throughout our day. Right? But it's to build the capacity to be in the stretch zone so that we never forget the interdependent nature of reality, because that is the dharma of who we are as a species.